Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Happy Practice Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Sierra, and today I am joined by someone who is, I don't even know what to call you. You do so many different things. I'm joined by Dr. Hendrik Lai. Hendrik, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Adam. I really appreciate being here and being able to add to the discussion.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Definitely. Well, I've been a clinician now for 25 odd years. Practiced dentistry for a lot of that time. Have worked across multiple industries. As a clinician as well as in the management consulting space. Now I mostly work with different DSOs and dental adjacent industries to help optimize production flows and business processes.
Awesome. You a couple of MBAs, a dental degree. You were an oral surgeon. Is there anything you haven't done?
Never been a hygienist, so
Okay.
or an archaeologist. It's still on the list.
So there's still time. We can
Yeah.
still get those done.
Yep. Fingers crossed.
Well, I appreciate you being here today, and we'll hop right into the substance of what we're here to talk about, which is when, how, and why to sell your practice. So many clinicians
Mm.
have put their entire life into their practice, right? And there comes a point where it's like, what do we do next? Do I pass this on to somebody else? Do I sell it? And what does that process looks like? And it can be really intimidating for a lot of people.
Mm.
So I know what we want to do today is kind of unbox that. Obviously, we're not lawyers. This isn't professional legal advice. These are just our opinions, but maybe giving some people some of that inspiration. So the first question that I wanted to ask was setting the stage. What are some of the most common reasons that a practice owner is going to be looking to sell in the first place?
Yeah, there's a few reasons, and I think you can categorize them into personal reasons and then professional reasons. In a number of circumstances, unfortunately, practice owners are required to sell because of a divorce or some sort of other personal circumstance requiring dissolution of the business and division of assets. A lot of those times, you do end up with a suboptimal sort of valuation just because there are timeframes involved, and oftentimes there is a non-clinician spouse for whom the assets are really it's not a viable business that they can participate in going forward because of their lack of licensure, etc. And on the other hand, in some cases, people are just ready to retire. People have had enough of dentistry. I think you've heard that old adage that dentistry is one of the most stressful professions. It used to be the profession with the highest suicide rate, and dentistry is stressful, and people do want to leave dentistry. And that could be for, as I said, reasons of divorce. It could be for reasons of old age. It could be reasons of personal injury where you can no longer practice. And then on the other side of it is the professional side. The reason that you are looking to exit your business is because you're trying to maximize the valuation at a specific moment that you can gain for the hard work, the equity, and the sweat that you've put into that business. I think there's a couple of sort of considerations is who do you expect to exit to and how do you want to exit? So broadly speaking, there's a number of categories of practices and how they would want to exit. But in very broad terms, you can exit as your traditional exit to an associate that comes in and works under you for a period of time, perhaps builds up a little bit of equity as part of their employment contract. Two is that you can exit to a DSO or a group. And three is that you can exit for salvage value. So where the business itself is not worth anything, but what you're really selling is the scrap value of any tangible assets, plants and equipment that you might have. And all of those really require a very, very specific approach to how the exit occurs and the lead up to that exit in order to maximize the value that you'll get for the business.
100% agree. And I really appreciate your thorough approach, just kind of laying out that landscape. If I'm and the people listening to this podcast, obviously your background's in dental and there's a lot of dentistry professionals in here. There's also people in the optometry and eye care industry, veterinary, aesthetics, physical therapy. But what we see in common is that, in this phenomenon of practice ownership, right? There's so much pressure and there's so much onus on the practice owner, right? So if I'm a practice owner, what are some signs that it might be time for me to exit the business?
Well, I think one of the things that even before you get to that, point of the signs of being ready to exit the business, I think it's a discussion you need to have, or people need to have with their loved ones, with their financial planners, with their lawyers before even entering the business. Because the one inevitability that you're going to have is an exit. Now, again, whether that's an exit through scrap, an exit to a DSO, exit to an associate, or you just walk away from the business completely. I think that, having that discussion before even entering business, and whether that's building out a de novo or doing some sort of acquisition, is very, very important. Now, in terms of when to begin the process of maybe planning for an exit, I encourage all of my clients to undertake a process called self-diligence. So during the transaction process, the seller will prepare a confidential informational memorandum and prepare a data room for a potential buyer. The buyer will then undertake a due diligence exercise to poke holes in any financials, any legal, any marketing, any operation, maybe clinical aspects. So with the intent to help them de-risk the transaction, what I encourage people to do even before they're considering selling, is to undertake a self-diligence process, which is taking that due diligence process that a buyer would undertake, or a theoretical buyer might undertake, and doing it yourself. Because there's an old axiom that says time kills deals. And as the seller, what you're trying to do is minimize the amount of time that it's going to take for a deal to go through. And then secondarily to that, you're trying to minimize any risk that the potential buyer is exposed to. Because when a buyer purchases a business, they're not really purchasing a business. What they're purchasing is cash flow. So your goal is to minimize the risk that that potential buyer or that buyer cannot maintain the cash flow that they're buying. So, when is the right time to do that? The right time is from day one, because you never know when an offer might come in, even though you're not potentially thinking of selling. But the ability to be able to transact quickly and with minimal risk is very important.
What you said is super profound, right? It's not just you begin preparing to exit in the couple months leading up to the exit. You begin preparing for that eventual possibility from day one, right? Now, for someone who that's a new concept to, what are some practical ways that somebody can actually do that and get started on, preparing for an eventual exit from their business?
Yeah, I think one of the key things is to surround yourself with a really solid due diligence or self-diligence team. Now, at a very minimum, that needs to include your legal team or legal counsel, needs to include your accountant. But I also encourage people to include a marketing, an IT and C component or consultant, and then an operations consultant within their self-diligence team. Again, the idea being to close any sort of loopholes or any sort of potential areas of risk that a buyer might encounter during the due diligence process, and hence hold up the transaction process. I think one of the key things as well is to really take stock of who do you want to exit to. If you want to exit to a DSO, understanding that a DSO or a corporate entity, perhaps a managed service organization, will look for something very different than an associate purchasing. And if you've already sort of decided in your mind that, hey, my ideal exit is going to be to a particular kind of buyer, and my ideal harvest period, so when you plan to sell your practice, is 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever that might look like, that's going to allow you to sort of set up appropriate systems, structures, and processes. So bring together people, processes, and the technology in order to, again, minimize and de-risk any transaction which occurs.
I love what you're talking about with minimizing risk and, de-risking as much as possible. And, on that note, if somebody's going to sell to a DSO, that's one thing. And a lot of times people will sell to somebody who's a private individual or someone they know. What are some things people should be looking for so they can find a good fit in the person that's going to be buying their practice?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question, Adam. I think I look at it from three perspectives and three broad categories that they need to be looking at. One is values. Does the potential buyer, particularly an individual, share your values? Secondly is the capability. Does that potential buyer or individual share the capabilities or possess the capabilities that are needed in order to maintain cash flow or even grow cash flow within your business? And then thirdly is opportunity. Is is the external environment ripe, and are there opportunities which exist which are going to be able to allow the buyer to leverage their capabilities and leverage those values? When when values, capabilities, and opportunity come together, that's when you derive a competitive advantage. So when you think about the ideal construct or the ideal persona of a potential buyer, always keep in mind those three broad categories: values, capability, and external opportunities.
On that same note, what are some of the financial and ethical and emotional things that people should keep in mind while they're going through this process of selling their practice? And again, this isn't legal advice for anybody, but as somebody you've known people that have
Mhm.
gone through this process, and I think you've gone through this process before too. What are some of those financial and emotional considerations people should keep in mind?
Yeah, I think that, I think starting initially with the emotional side of things, because we know that people make decisions based on emotion, and then we try and justify it later on with, with logic and rationale and reasoning. I think first thing is to accept that selling your practice is akin to losing something. So accept that you're probably going to go through the 5 stages of grief. Um, so there is going to be, you've worked on this practice for 10, 15, 20 years or whatever it is. It's become your baby. So exiting it is going to be a grief-filled moment. So expect and understand that, yes, even though rationally we know that it's a business, it's just a business, you are likely to experience those 5 stages of grief, from denial all the way through to acceptance that this is actually what's happening. You might waver during that, but understand that you'll come out of it stronger. Now, from a financial perspective, I think, again, to circle back, that you're buying cash flow. And one of the key things to really consider is, how do you expect to value this business? Yeah, there's a range of valuation models, one from scrap or salvage value. So just the value that you can potentially sell any equipment to the junkyard or the scrapyard for, all the way to more sophisticated models like discounted cash flow models, weighted cost of capital models. Um, and what's very popular in a lot of healthcare valuations is a percentage of same store sales, which I'm not particularly fond of because it doesn't really give an idea of cash flow. So I think that's one of the key things you're really going to want to consider, is how you're going to value things. But with that being said, I also always tell clients that, remember, valuation is calculated, price is negotiated. So even though you might come up with a valuation number, that really just serves as a guide, and where the real work starts is the negotiation around that valuation number for the final price.
Love that. And yeah, thank you again for all the detail, and it's super interesting to hear. If I'm a practice owner right now and I'm listening to what you're saying and I want to increase the valuation of my business, what are some things that people can do that might be relatively simple tweaks and improvements that can actually substantially increase the value of their business?
Well, I think particularly in healthcare, what we tend to find is that the cost base that we expose ourselves to in healthcare tends to be very skewed towards fixed costs. So, for example, in dentistry, your cost base in terms of your fixed costs is 85 to 90%. So one of the ways that you can drive increased value in your business is, particularly if you're a single doctor location, or you're having maybe one or two locations where you don't have true economy of scale yet, is to begin thinking about converting some of that fixed cost base to a variable cost base. You'll be able to scale a little bit more adequately, because accepting that you're really not going to achieve scale economy, you're probably not going to have sort of a network effect within that one or two locations. having cornered resources with a relatively small number of locations is very difficult to achieve. So I think that conversion of how do you move some of those fixed costs, and a really good example of fixed cost would be your payroll, and how do you convert that into a variable cost? That could be through process optimization, it could be through automation, it could be through the implementation of enabling technologies to drive some of those operational efficiencies. So, just really look closely at your cost base, get a handle on what percentage of your costs are fixed cost versus variable cost, and look to sort of draw down as much of that fixed cost and convert it to variable cost as possible. Now, where you do have economy of scale, and maybe you've got 10, 15, 20 locations, the reverse is true. Convert where possible, and where you have economy of scale, and particularly you have network effect, consider switching your cost base from a variable cost through to a fixed cost to optimize the unit economics and minimize the per unit cost that you're going to experience.
As we wrap this up, what would be your final pieces of advice for, somebody who's out there looking to potentially sell their practice?
One of the advice I would give is that in today's sort of practice transition era, there are multiple ways to sell your practice. Gone are the days where you sold through a broker. Gone are the days where you had to sell to an associate. Now you've got multiple options. Yes, broker sales are still an option. Direct sales that don't involve a broker are still an option. But another model to consider for a transaction is the use of a marketplace. So very similar to an eBay type of model or Amazon model. It brings potential buyers and potential sellers together in an even marketplace where you don't necessarily have to have face-to-face interactions, but it helps to sort of move the deal forward, and it helps to legitimize the deal, because now you have the weight of a larger marketplace behind you. So I would encourage people to think about, what is my exit timeline? Who do I want to exit to? And how do I want to have this exit occur?
Fantastic. I know I learned a ton, and I'm sure that everyone listening to this learned a ton. Thank you, Dr. Hendrik Lai, or as we affectionately know here, Weave, just as Hendrik. Because what's the line you say?
Oh, don't say Dr. Lai in my family. You'll have 14 people turn around. So Hendrik is the way to go.
Hendrik, thanks for joining us on the show, and thank you to everyone who watched and listened and otherwise participated. And until next time, stay happy. Take care.
Thank you.